There are winters that test the human spirit, winters that strip away everything comfortable and easy and leave only the essential questions. Will we survive? Will we endure? And perhaps most importantly, who will we be in the face of scarcity and suffering? In the medieval villages of Europe, these were not abstract philosophical questions. They were matters of life and death, asked and answered every year when the cold months came and food stores dwindled and families huddled together in the darkness, hoping to see spring again. Tonight, I want to tell you about one such winter, one particular village, and one woman whose simple act of kindness became the seed of a miracle that would be remembered and retold for centuries. It is a story about bread, that most basic and essential of foods, the foundation of medieval life, the difference between survival and starvation. But more than that, it is a story about generosity that defies logic, about giving when you have nothing left to give, about faith that manifests not in grand declarations, but in the quiet choice to share your last measure of flour with a hungry neighbor. The story is called the Christmas bread that never ran out, though different regions knew it by different names. Some called it the widow's barrel. Others referred to it as the miracle of the endless loaves. In parts of Germany, it was known as das Wunderbrot, the Wonder Bread. In Celtic regions, it was sometimes linked to older stories of magical cauldrons that never emptied, ancient pre-Christian traditions absorbed into Christmas folklore and transformed by faith into something new yet familiar. Like many medieval miracles, this story exists in multiple versions, told differently depending on who was telling it and where and when. Sometimes the widow had 3 children, sometimes 5, sometimes she was alone. Sometimes the miracle happened on Christmas Eve, sometimes on the night before, sometimes it lasted 1 night, sometimes 3. The details shifted like snow in the wind, but the heart of the story remained constant. A woman who had almost nothing chose to give everything, and in that giving, discovered that some vessels can never truly be emptied, that generosity creates its own abundance, that love multiplies like loaves and fishes in a story told long ago in a different time and place, but carrying the same essential truth. Medieval people needed these stories. They needed to believe that kindness mattered, that sacrifice would be honored, that God saw their struggles and sometimes, just sometimes, intervened in ways that defied natural law and ordinary expectation. Winter was long and dark and cold. Hunger was a constant presence in their lives. Not an occasional inconvenience, but a genuine threat that returned every year when the harvest ended and the long months of survival began. They stored what they could in autumn, rationed carefully through winter, and prayed that their supplies would last until spring brought new growth and new hope. But some winters were worse than others. Some years the harvest failed, or came late, or was smaller than needed. Some years illness swept through a village, leaving families unable to work, unable to prepare adequately, unable to do all the things that survival required. And some years winter simply came harder and colder and longer than anyone expected, stretching food supplies beyond their limits, testing faith and endurance and the bonds that held communities together. This story comes from one of those terrible winters, a winter that pushed people to the edge of what they could bear, a winter when the question was not whether Christmas would be celebrated joyfully, but whether anyone would survive to see it at all. Into that darkness, into that desperation, came a small miracle, the kind that did not change the course of nations or appear in official church records, but changed everything for the people who experienced it, who received warm bread on a night when they had none, who felt their hunger eased not by their own provision, but by the mysterious multiplication of one woman's generosity. So let us go back to a time when winters were harsher and life was harder, and people gathered around fires to tell stories that reminded them why hope was reasonable even when circumstances suggested otherwise. Let us meet the widow and her children, see their empty cupboards and their cold hearth, understand their fear and their faith. And let us witness what happened when compassion met crisis, when the choice to give created something that reason could not explain, but the heart could understand perfectly. The village was small, as most medieval villages were. Perhaps 40 families, maybe 150 souls total, living in timber frame cottages clustered around a central green and a stone church that had stood for centuries, serving generation after generation of villagers who came to be baptized, married, and eventually buried in the churchyard that surrounded it on three sides. The houses were simple structures, walls made of timber filled with wattle and daub, roofs thatched with straw or reeds, weighted with stones to keep the winter winds from tearing them away. Each house had a central hearth where families cooked their meals, warmed themselves, and gathered in the evenings when outside work was done. In summer, the village was a pleasant place. Fields of grain surrounded it, stretching toward the forest that provided wood for building and fuel. Gardens grew vegetables behind each cottage. Chickens scratched in yards. Cows and sheep grazed in common pastures. The river that ran nearby provided water for drinking and washing, and fish could sometimes be caught there, supplementing the diet of bread and porridge and whatever meat the villagers could afford or raise themselves. Life was not easy, even in summer. Medieval peasants worked from dawn to dusk, their labor demanded by the rhythms of agriculture and the requirements of the lord whose land they worked. But it was sustainable, manageable, a life that could be lived if you were strong and careful and fortunate enough to avoid the many dangers that could befall a person in those times. But winter transformed everything. The fields that had been golden with grain became empty expanses of frozen mud and snow. The gardens lay barren under frost. The animals that had grazed freely were brought into barns, or even into the houses themselves, for their warmth and because they were too valuable to risk losing to cold or predators. The rivers sometimes froze solid, sometimes remained partially open, its dark water a reminder of the danger that cold water posed to anyone who fell in. The forest became a place of shadows and silence, the trees stripped bare, the ground covered in snow that showed every footprint, every track of deer or wolf or fox. This particular winter had been brutal from the start. It came early, in October, bringing snow that did not melt, cold that settled in and refused to leave. November was worse, with storms that piled drifts against cottage walls, that made travel between houses dangerous, that turned simple tasks into ordeals. By December, when our story takes its place, the village was in crisis. Food stores that should have lasted until March were already running dangerously low. The harvest had been poor, smaller than needed, struck by early frost that had damaged the grain while it still stood in the fields. What had been gathered was not enough, and everyone knew it. They could ration more strictly, eat less, make every grain of wheat or rye stretch further. But mathematics does not lie. There was not enough. Some would go hungry. Some might not survive. In one of the smaller cottages at the edge of the village lived a widow. Her name, like many details in this story, varies in the telling. Some versions call her Anna, others Margaret or Elizabeth. What remained constant was her situation. She was alone with her 3 children, trying to survive in a world that offered little support for women without husbands. Her husband had died 2 years prior. Some versions say from illness, others from an accident. The specifics less important than the result. She had been left with their cottage, a small plot of land, the few possessions they had accumulated, and 3 young children who needed feeding and clothing and care. She worked when she could, doing washing for families who could afford to pay someone, taking and mending, helping with harvest in summer and autumn, accepting whatever labor she could find that would bring in a few coins or some food or a measure of grain. Her neighbors helped when they could, sharing what they had, mindful of the Christian duty to care for widows and orphans, conscious that any of them might find themselves in similar circumstances if fortune turned against them. But this winter, no one had extra to share. Everyone was struggling. Everyone was hungry. Everyone was making the same grim calculations about whether their stores would last. The widow's cottage was particularly modest, just 2 rooms, one where the family lived and slept and cooked, another small space where they kept what little they owned. The hearth dominated the main room, the source of warmth and the place where meals were prepared in a large iron pot that hung over the flames. There was a rough wooden table, a few stools, a pallet bed where the children slept huddled together for warmth, a smaller bed where the widow herself tried to rest between the work that filled her days. The walls were bare except for a simple wooden cross, a reminder of faith that sustained her when circumstances threatened to overwhelm. In the corner stood a wooden barrel, bound with iron hoops, standing perhaps 3 feet high. This was the flour barrel, the most important possession in any medieval household after the hearth itself. Flour was life. Flour was survival. From flour came bread. the staple food that made up the majority of medieval diet. A family might eat bread for breakfast, bread and soup for midday dinner, bread with perhaps some cheese or meat for supper if they were fortunate. Bread was eaten with every meal, was the foundation of every dish, was so central to existence that when people prayed, "Give us this day our daily bread," they were not being poetic but utterly literal. Bread was daily life. Without bread, there was hunger, weakness, eventually starvation. The widow's flour barrel, which should have been full or at least half full in December, held only a thin layer at the bottom, perhaps enough for one more loaf if she was careful, if she measured precisely, if she added more water than usual to stretch the dough as far as it would go. She had been rationing for weeks, baking smaller loaves, stretching meals, giving most of her own portions to her children while pretending she had already eaten or was not hungry. The children were thin, their faces showing the hollowness that came from insufficient food. They did not complain. Children in those times learned early not to ask for what could not be given. But she saw their hunger in their eyes, felt it in her own constantly empty stomach, lived with the knowledge that she was failing in the most basic parental duty, to keep her children fed. Bread in medieval culture was more than just food. It was sacred, bound up with religious significance, connected to the body of Christ in the Eucharist, symbolic of divine provision and human community. The sharing of bread created bonds between people. To invite someone to break bread with you was to offer friendship, hospitality, trust. To refuse to share bread was a profound rejection, a violation of social and spiritual obligations. Bread was blessed before being eaten. Prayers of thanksgiving offered to God who provided the grain and the sun and the rain that made the grain grow. Wasting bread was considered sinful, a failure to respect God's gifts. Even the smallest crumbs were saved, used in soups or fed to animals, nothing discarded carelessly. The widow understood all this. She had grown up in this village, had learned these lessons from her mother and grandmother, had absorbed the values and beliefs that shaped how people thought about food and sharing and obligation. She knew that on Christmas Eve, the holiest night of the year, it was customary to share what you had, to invite travelers to your table, to give to those who had less than you did. She knew the stories of how Christ had been born in poverty, how the Holy Family had depended on the kindness of strangers, how angels had announced the birth first to shepherds, the poorest and lowest members of society. Christmas was about God choosing vulnerability, about divinity entering the world not in power and glory, but as a helpless infant, about the wealthy being sent away empty while the poor and humble were lifted up and filled with good things. But how could she share when she had nothing? How could she practice hospitality when her own children were hungry? How could she think about others when her own family faced starvation? These questions tormented her as Christmas approached, as she looked at her nearly empty flour barrel, as she calculated and recalculated, trying to find some solution that did not exist. If she used the last of her flour for one more meal for her children, they would have nothing for Christmas Day, nothing for the days after. If she tried to stretch it across multiple meals, no one would have enough at any meal. There was no good choice, only impossible ones, only the selection of which suffering to endure. The days before Christmas passed in a fog of anxiety and cold. The village itself was quieter than usual, subdued by the weight of winter and hunger. There were no celebrations being planned, no feasts being prepared, no joyful anticipation of the holy day. Instead, there was a grim determination to survive, to endure, to make it through this terrible winter and hope for better times ahead. The church bells rang for services, and people attended when they could, seeking what comfort faith could provide when material comfort was absent. The priest spoke of hope and patience, of trusting in divine providence, of remembering that Christ too had known hunger and suffering. His words offered some solace, some framework for understanding their situation, but they did not fill empty stomachs or warm cold cottages. On the afternoon of Christmas Eve, as the short winter day began its early slide toward evening, the widow stood in her cottage looking at her flour barrel. Her children were huddled by the hearth, trying to absorb what little warmth remained from the small fires she had allowed herself, precious fuel saved for this holy night. She had to make a decision. Should she bake the last of the flour into one loaf for her children? Should she save it for tomorrow, for Christmas Day itself? Should she try to stretch it somehow, though she knew the mathematics made no sense, that you cannot multiply by dividing, that less is simply less no matter how you try to manage it. And as she stood there, as she wrestled with these questions, another thought came to her, unbidden and illogical, a thought that made no practical sense, but somehow felt true, felt right, felt like the voice of something deeper than her own desperate reasoning. What if, instead of hoarding this last bit of flour for her own family, she used it for others? What if she baked bread not for her children, but for her neighbors who were also hungry, also suffering, also desperate? Would that not be what Christ would want? Would that not honor the spirit of Christmas, the message of generosity and selflessness and love? The thought was absurd. It was impractical to the point of madness. She had 3 hungry children depending on her. She had no husband to provide for them, no other source of food, no reserves to fall back on. To give away their last flour would be to condemn them all to hunger with nothing held back, no emergency provision, no safety net. Every reasonable part of her mind said no, said this was foolishness, said a mother's first duty was to her own children, said that generosity did not require self-destruction. But another part of her, a part that lived deeper than reason, that spoke with the voice of faith and intuition in something she could not quite name, said yes. Said that sometimes you had to give even when, especially when, you had nothing to spare. Said that the story of the loaves and fishes was not just an ancient tale, but a present reality, that abundance could come from scarcity if you were willing to start with sharing rather than hoarding. Said that God honored foolish generosity more than prudent selfishness, that the widow in the temple who gave her last 2 coins had been praised above the wealthy who gave from their surplus. She stood there for a long time, the light fading outside, the cold deepening, her children watching her with trust in their eyes, trust she feared she was about to betray. And then, with a prayer that was more feeling than words, more surrender than petition, she made her choice. The widow reached into the barrel with her wooden scoop, the same scoop her mother had used, worn smooth by decades of use, the handle polished by countless hands measuring countless meals. She knew by feel how much flour remained, could judge by the weight and the depth of the scoop whether there was enough for 1 loaf or 2, whether she would need to add extra water or could make proper dough that would rise well and bake into bread with good texture and flavor. This time, the scoop scraped the bottom of the barrel, collecting what little remained, bringing up perhaps 3 measures, maybe 4 if she was careful about getting every last grain from the corners and the cracks. She emptied the flour into her largest wooden bowl, the one reserved for bread making, setting the bowl on the table where the children could not see it, could not watch their last food being transformed into something that would not be theirs to eat. She added water from the bucket, her hands moving through the familiar motions of bread making, motions so practiced they required no thought. Flour and water, mixed together to form a shaggy mass, then needed to develop the gluten, to create the structure that would hold air and rise and become the texture of proper bread. Her hands worked the dough, pushing and folding, the rhythm meditative, the physical labor a temporary distraction from the enormity of what she was doing. As she kneaded, she prayed. Not formal prayers, not the Latin words of the church liturgy that she knew but did not fully understand, but her own words, simple and direct. She asked for help. She asked for provision. She asked that somehow, impossibly, this choice would not result in her children's suffering. She asked for faith to sustain her through whatever was coming, for strength to face the consequences of this decision, for peace about giving away what she could not afford to give. And beneath all these specific requests was a deeper prayer, wordless and formless, a simple offering up of her situation, her fear, her trust, her surrender to forces larger than herself. The dough came together under her hands, smooth and elastic, ready for rising. She shaped it into a round loaf, placed it in a cloth-lined basket to rise while she prepared the hearth for baking. The fire needed building up, the ashes needed clearing, the flat baking stone needed positioning correctly to receive the loaf. She worked efficiently, her movements practiced from years of daily bread making, this most essential of household tasks that every woman learned from childhood and performed throughout her life. While the dough rose, while the fire grew hotter, while the cottage filled with warmth from the flames, she explained to her children what she was doing. She told them that she was baking bread for their neighbors who were also hungry, who had even less than they did, who needed this gift on this holy night. She told them about Christmas, about giving, about how sometimes we have to trust that there is more to life than what we can see and measure and control. She told them the story of the loaves and fishes, how Jesus had taken a small amount of food and multiplied it to feed thousands, how that ancient miracle showed that God's mathematics worked differently than human calculations. The children listened with the solemn attention children give to matters they sense are important even if they don't fully understand. The oldest, a girl of perhaps 7 or 8, asked if they would have anything to eat. The widow answered honestly. She did not know. She had no more flour. She had no plan beyond this bread. But she believed, she said, and as she said it, she realized she truly did believe, despite everything, that somehow they would be cared for, that this giving would not result in abandonment, that God noticed sparrows when they fell, and surely noticed when a mother fed her neighbors instead of her children out of faith that provision would come from somewhere, somehow. The middle child, a boy of 5 or 6, said he understood. The youngest, barely more than a toddler, simply nodded, trusting without needing explanation, accepting what the adults around him said with the total faith of early childhood that has not yet learned to doubt or question or worry about tomorrow. The dough rose. The fire burned hot. The widow slid the loaf onto the baking stone and covered it with a clay dome to trap the heat, to create the little oven within the hearth where bread transformed from pale dough into golden sustenance. The smell began almost immediately, that incomparable aroma of baking bread that has drawn people to tables and hearths for thousands of years, that speaks of home and comfort and life itself. The children's stomachs audibly growled in response to the smell. The widow felt her own hunger sharpen into acute physical pain, her body protesting this cruelty of smelling food that would not be hers to eat. The bread baked, and darkness fell completely outside. Christmas Eve night, the holiest night of the year, had arrived. In the village, families were gathering for whatever poor celebrations they could manage, lighting candles in their windows, preparing to walk to the church for midnight mass, trying to find some joy despite their circumstances. Some would have a bit of meat saved for Christmas dinner tomorrow. Some would have extra portions of their usual food, marking the day as special even if not abundant. Most would simply have what they always had, perhaps a bit less. Hunger, their constant companion, even on this night, meant for feasting and celebration. When the bread was done, when the widow removed it from the hearth and saw the golden brown crust, heard the hollow sound it made when tapped, smelled the full, rich aroma of properly baked bread, she felt a moment of regret so intense it took her breath away. This bread could feed her children. This bread could ease their hunger for at least one day. This bread represented survival, and she was about to give it away. But she had made her choice, and she would honor it. She wrapped the hot loaf in a clean cloth, feeling its warmth through the fabric, its weight in her hands. She set it on the table and looked at it for a long moment. This last bread from the last of her flour. This gift that would empty her completely. This offering that made no sense except to faith, which insisted that sense was not the only measure of truth, that logic was not the only guide to right action, that sometimes you had to step forward without knowing where your foot would land and trust that ground would appear beneath it. Before the widow could decide who to give the bread to, before she could choose which neighbor most needed this gift, there came a knock at her door. Soft at first, hesitant, the knock of someone who was not certain of their welcome, who was asking for something they have no right to expect. She opened the door to find an elderly man from the village, someone she knew by sight though not by close acquaintance, standing in the snow with his walking stick, his thin frame shaking with cold, his face gaunt with hunger. He had heard, he said, that she might have bread. Someone had seen smoke from her fire, had smelled baking, had mentioned it, and the word had spread in that mysterious way that information travels to small communities even when no one means to gossip or intrude. He was sorry to ask, he continued, knew she had little herself, but he had not eaten in 2 days. And if she had even a small piece to spare, even a crust, he would be grateful, would remember her kindness, would pray for her and her children. The widow looked at this man, at his need so visible in his face and his posture, and she felt something shift inside her, some last resistance to what she was doing dissolve in the face of immediate, undeniable human suffering. She took the loaf from the table, still warm in its cloth, and she broke off half of it, perhaps more than half, and she gave it to him, placing it directly in his gnarled hands, wrapping his fingers around it so he would not drop it. His response was not dramatic. Medieval people did not express emotion the way we do, did not overflow with theatrical gratitude or effusive thanks. But his eyes filled with tears that did not fall, and he nodded to her with a dignity that somehow made the moment more profound than any amount of gushing appreciation could have achieved. He thanked her simply, blessed her and her children, turned and walked back into the night, clutching the bread like the precious thing it was. The widow closed the door and returned to the table where half a loaf now remained where there had been a whole one. She looked at what was left and wondered how she had imagined this would work, how she had thought one loaf could possibly help anyone when there was so much need all around. Half a loaf would not feed her children. It would not last through tomorrow. It was not enough, and she had just made it even less by giving most of it away. But before she could pursue this thought, before she could descend into the despair that waited at the edges of her consciousness, there came another knock. A woman this time, someone from the other side of the village, holding a small child bundled against the cold. She had heard, she said with embarrassment, that there might be bread. Her child had been crying from hunger all day, and she had nothing to give him, and if there was even a small piece, anything at all, she would be grateful beyond words. The widow looked at the remaining half loaf. She looked at the child, whose face she could barely see in the darkness and the wrapping of cloth, but whose hunger she could sense in the mother's desperate eyes. And she broke the half into portions, keeping back only a small piece for her own children. And she gave the larger portion to the woman, who received it as if it were gold, as if it were a miracle already, as if this simple gift of bread was more than food, was hope itself made tangible. The woman left, and the widow stood at her table looking at the small remaining piece of bread, knowing it was not enough for 3 children, knowing that she had again given away what she could not spare, knowing that the morning would come and they would be hungry and she would have nothing to give them. The practical part of her mind screamed that this was madness, that she was failing in her duty, that generosity had limits and she had exceeded them. But then came another knock, and another, and another. One by one, through the evening, villagers came to her door. Some she knew well, neighbors she had lived beside for years. Others were more distant, people from the edges of the village, people she recognized but had rarely spoken with. Each came with the same hesitation, the same apologetic need, the same desperate hunger that this terrible winter had imposed on all of them without distinction or mercy. And to each one, the widow gave bread. She took that small remaining piece and broke off portions from it, somehow finding enough in what remained to give to each person who came, each hungry mouth, each desperate request. The piece that should have been exhausted after the second or third person somehow continued to yield portions for the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. She was not performing any deliberate magic, not speaking any incantations or prayers over the bread. She was simply breaking off what was needed and finding that what remained was sufficient for the next person, and the next, and the next. At some point in this process, she could not say exactly when, the widow began to notice something extraordinary. She would reach for the bread to break off another portion, and there seemed to be more than there should be. Not dramatically more, not obviously multiplied, but somehow, when she looked at what remained after giving to each person, it seemed about the same size as it had been before she broke off the last piece. It was subtle enough that she thought at first she was imagining it, that stress and hunger were affecting her perception, that she was simply mistaken about how much bread she had started with. But as the evening wore on, as more people came and more portions were given, the impossibility of what was happening became undeniable. That small remaining piece from the half loaf, from the single loaf baked from the last flour in her barrel, could not possibly be feeding this many people. The mathematics did not work. The natural laws that govern bread and breaking and distribution were being suspended or transcended or somehow rendered irrelevant in the face of need and generosity. She looked at the bread in her hands with growing wonder and terror. Wonder because she was witnessing something that should not be possible, something that felt like the old stories come to life, like the ancient miracles made present and immediate. Terror because the sacred was manifesting in her cottage, in her hands, through her actions, and the divine is always both beautiful and frightening, always fills the human heart with awe that includes an element of fear, of awareness that we are in the presence of something far greater than ourselves. The widow's children watched this procession of hungry villagers with wide eyes. They saw their mother breaking bread and giving it away again and again. They saw the gratitude in the faces of those who received it. They saw the bread somehow continuing to exist despite being constantly divided and distributed. The oldest child asked her mother what was happening, and the widow answered truthfully that she did not know, that something was happening that she could not explain, that they were witnessing something holy. Through the evening the visitors came, by twos and threes, and sometimes singly. They approached her door, drawn by words spreading through the village that there was bread at the widow's cottage, bread being freely given, bread for anyone who needed it. The supply should have been exhausted almost immediately, but it continued. The bread in the widow's hands continued to yield portions for each person who came, each request that was made. She gave to families, breaking off enough for parents and children. She gave to solitary villagers, those living alone, those without family support. She gave to people she liked and people she had quarreled with, to the respected and the outcast, to the old and the young, making no distinctions, asking no questions, simply giving to each one what they needed, trusting that there would be enough for the next, finding impossibly that there was. The quality of the bread did not diminish as the evening progressed. Each portion was as fresh, as warm, as properly baked as the first piece she had given away. The bread did not dry out or grow stale. It did not lose its structure or become crumbly. It remained perfect bread, the kind that only comes from good flour properly mixed and kneaded and baked, the kind that should have been impossible from her meager supply, even if the supply had not been mysteriously sustaining itself. Some of the villagers who came understood immediately that something extraordinary was happening. They saw the small piece in the widow's hands yielding portion after portion without diminishing. They recognized this as miracle, as divine intervention, as Christmas grace made manifest in the most basic and necessary form, bread for the hungry. These villagers received their portions with reverence, treating the bread as sacred, crossing themselves before eating it, offering prayers of thanksgiving not just for the food, but for the sign, for the evidence of divine care, for the reminder that God had not forgotten them in their suffering. Others were so consumed by their own hunger, their own immediate need, that they did not notice the impossibility of what was happening. They simply received the bread with gratitude, ate it to ease their gnawing stomachs, and went home feeling relief that at least for this one night, they would not go to bed completely empty. Their lack of awareness did not diminish the miracle. They were fed regardless of whether they recognized the extraordinary nature of how their feeding was accomplished. As midnight approached, as the time came for villagers to make their way to the church for the Christmas Mass, the flow of visitors to the widow's cottage slowed and then stopped. She stood at her table, the small piece of bread still in her hands, and she looked at it with a mixture of emotions too complex to name. Gratitude, certainly. Wonder, absolutely. But also exhaustion, both physical and emotional. The draining effect of having been the channel through which this miracle had flowed. The weight of having been chosen. Why her? Why her cottage? Why tonight, as the instrument of divine provision? She looked at her children, who had watched this entire evening unfold, who had seen their mother give away their last food, and somehow not leave them with nothing, who had witnessed something that would shape their understanding of faith and generosity for the rest of their lives. She took the remaining bread, and there was remaining bread, more than seemed reasonable, more than that small piece should have contained even after all the giving, and she divided it among her 3 children. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, understanding without being told that this was not ordinary bread, that they were eating something holy, something miraculous, something that tasted of wheat and water and salt, but also of grace and mercy, and the kind of love that gives everything and somehow finds itself with more to give. The bread satisfied their hunger completely, filled them in a way that went beyond the physical, left them feeling not just fed but nourished at some deeper level. When they had finished eating, when the last crumbs had been carefully collected and consumed, the widow noticed something. The flour barrel, which she had scraped empty hours earlier, which should have been completely bare, had a thin layer of flour at the bottom. Not much, certainly not as much as had been there that morning, but enough, perhaps, for another small loaf tomorrow. Enough to mean they would not face Christmas Day with absolutely nothing. enough to suggest that the miracle had extended beyond the evening's giving to provide for those who had facilitated the giving. The widow approached the flour barrel slowly, almost afraid to look inside, afraid that what she had glimpsed in the dim light was an illusion, a trick of exhausted eyes and overstressed mind. But when she looked directly into the barrel, when she held her candle over it to see clearly, the flour was there. Not a full barrel, not even a quarter full, but a layer covering the bottom, perhaps 3 or 4 inches deep, enough for 2 or 3 more loaves if she was careful. She reached in with her hand, touched the flour, felt its cool, powdery reality, lifted a handful and let it sift through her fingers back into the barrel. It was real flour, ordinary wheat flour, exactly like what had been in the barrel before. There was nothing magical about its appearance or texture. It was simply flour where no flour should be, existence where emptiness should reign, provision appearing from impossibility. Her mind tried to rationalize what she was seeing. Perhaps she had been mistaken about how empty the barrel was. Perhaps in her stress and hunger she had misjudged, had thought there was less than there actually was. And what she was seeing now was simply the flour that had always been there, hiding in the corners and curves of the barrel's construction. But she knew this was not true. She knew with absolute certainty that she had scraped every last grain from this barrel hours ago, had run her scoop along the bottom and sides, had collected everything that could be collected. This flour had not been there before. This flour was new, appeared, given miraculous. She stood there for a long time, looking into the barrel, trying to understand what had happened, what was still happening. The bread that had multiplied in her hands, feeding person after person without diminishing, that had been miracle enough, strange enough, impossible enough. But this flour, this replenishment of the very source from which the miracle had flowed, this suggested something even more profound, that the giving had not merely been sustained through one evening, but was continuing, that the provision was not just for those who had come to her door, but for her own family as well, that the widow who had given everything had not been forgotten in the distribution of grace. She thought of the biblical stories she had heard all her life, stories of widows and miraculous provision that seemed to echo and reflect each other across the centuries. The widow of Zarephath, who had fed the prophet Elijah from her last measure of flour and oil, and whose flour and oil had not run out until the famine ended. The widow's mite, the 2 small coins given by a poor woman that Jesus had valued above the large donations of the wealthy, because she had given all she had. Widows appeared again and again in these stories. Their poverty made the stage for demonstrations of divine care, their faithfulness in the face of scarcity rewarded with unexpected abundance. Was she now part of this tradition? Had her story joined the ancient pattern of widows who gave what they could not afford to give and found that they had not given everything after all, that some reserve remained, that the bottom of the barrel was not truly empty? The thought was overwhelming, humbling beyond words. The idea that her small act of faith had connected her to something so much larger than herself, to a story that stretched back through centuries and would perhaps continue forward into futures she would never see. She reached into the barrel and scooped out enough flour for the next day, measuring it carefully, treating it with the reverence it deserved. As she poured the flour into her bowl, preparing to set it aside for tomorrow's baking, she noticed something remarkable. The level in the barrel seemed unchanged. She had taken out perhaps 2 measures of flour, enough to lower the level noticeably, but the barrel looked exactly as it had before she scooped, the thin layers still covering the bottom, still suggesting the same depth and quantity. Her hands began to shake. She set the bowl down and scooped again, this time watching carefully, paying close attention to every detail. The scoop went into the flour, filled, came out laden with fine white powder. She emptied it into the bowl, and then she looked back at the barrel. The level had not dropped. The flour remained at the same depth, the same distribution across the bottom, as if she had taken nothing at all. She scooped a 3rd time, then a 4th, each time watching, each time seeing the same impossible result. The flour came out of the barrel in generous scoops, accumulating in her bowl until she had far more than she had planned to use tomorrow, enough for several loaves, enough to feed her children properly for days. But the barrel itself showed no depletion. The flour at the bottom remained constant, unchanging, an endless supply contained in what should have been finite space. The widow's legs gave way beneath her, and she sank to the floor beside the barrel, her hand still clutching the scoop, her bowl of flour beside her, tears streaming down her face. These were not tears of sadness or fear, but of something else entirely, some emotion that had no single name, but combined gratitude and awe and relief and joy and an overwhelming sense of being seen, being known, being cared for by forces far beyond her understanding or control. She wept because she had been hungry and had given away food and had not been left to starve. She wept because she had chosen faith over prudence and had not been proven a fool. She wept because she had acted on the quiet voice that said to give rather than hoard, and that voice had been vindicated, had been shown to be not her own desperate rationalization, but something true, something connected to the deep structure of reality, something that understood laws higher than the natural laws that governed ordinary life. Her children came to her, drawn by her tears, worried that something was wrong. She gathered them to her and tried to explain what was happening, but words failed. How could she make them understand? How could anyone understand who had not stood beside this barrel, had not scooped flour that did not diminish, had not witnessed provision appearing from emptiness? She simply held them and told them that they were safe, that they would have bread tomorrow and the day after, that God had not forgotten them, that their mother's faith, foolish and impractical as it must have seemed, had been honored in ways she could never have imagined or anticipated. They sat together on the floor of their cottage, the widow and her 3 children, the flour barrel standing beside them like a silent witness, the candle burning low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Outside, the village was making its way to church for midnight mass, lanterns bobbing through the darkness, voices raised in hymns that carried through the cold air. Inside this small cottage, a different kind of worship was taking place, wordless and overwhelmed, the kind of prayer that happens when miracle strips away all pretense and leaves the soul naked before mystery. Word of what had happened at the widow's cottage spread through the village with the speed that important news always travels in small communities. Those who had received bread told others. Those others told still others. By the time the villagers gathered at the church for Christmas Mass, everyone knew that something extraordinary had occurred, that the poor widow with 3 children had somehow fed most of the village from 1 loaf of bread, that people who had knocked at her door hungry had left fed, that the bread had not run out despite being divided and distributed again and again. The reactions varied. Some accepted the story immediately, recognizing it as the kind of miracle that happens at Christmas, that sacred time when the boundary between heaven and earth becomes thin, when signs and wonders remind people that the world contains more than what ordinary eyes can see. These villagers gave thanks, incorporated this event into their understanding of divine providence, added it to their store of evidence that God cared about their struggles and sometimes intervened in direct and undeniable ways. Others were more skeptical, suggesting natural explanations, proposing that perhaps the widow had hidden stores she had not mentioned, that perhaps others had contributed bread without saying so, that perhaps the whole story was being exaggerated in the telling the way stories always are when they pass from mouth to mouth. These villagers were not hostile to the idea of miracle, but they were cautious, requiring more evidence, more time, more confirmation before accepting that natural law had been suspended in the widow's cottage on Christmas Eve. But regardless of how they interpreted the events, all the villagers agreed on one undeniable fact. Hungry people had been fed, whether by miracle or by more ordinary means, whether the bread had multiplied supernaturally or had simply been distributed with unusual generosity. The result was the same. People who had gone to the widow's door with empty stomachs had left with full ones. Children who had been crying from hunger had been quieted. The elderly and the weak had received sustenance. On the night when Christians celebrated Christ's birth, when the central message was of divine love taking human form, the most vulnerable members of the village had been cared for in the most basic and necessary way. The priest, when he heard the story, saw in it a lesson that needed to be shared, a teaching moment that perfectly illustrated the Christmas message. During the Mass, as he stood before his flock in the small stone church with its simple altar and its few candles, he spoke of the widow and her bread. He spoke of how she had chosen to give rather than hoard, how she had trusted rather than calculated, how she had opened her hands rather than clenching them closed, and whether or not the bread had multiplied miraculously. And he, unlike some of his parishioners, had no doubt that it had. The true miracle was in her heart, in the choice she made, in the faith that said giving was better than keeping even when keeping seemed necessary for survival. He spoke of how Christmas was about this very thing, about God giving what could not be spared, about heaven emptying itself into human form, about divine power choosing vulnerability, about abundance flowing from what seemed like scarcity. The bread that had fed the village was a sign, he said, a small mirror of the larger truth that Christmas proclaimed, that love multiplies when shared, that generosity creates its own abundance, that faith is not belief in the absence of evidence, but trust that acts before evidence appears. The villagers listened with particular attention that night, their usual Christmas homily given new weight by the events of the evening, the familiar words made fresh by their connection to something they had witnessed, something that had happened not in ancient times or distant places, but here, now, to people they knew. The abstract theological concepts of grace and provision and divine care had become concrete, tangible, as real as bread. When Mass ended, when the villagers left the church to return to their homes through the snow and the darkness, they stopped at the widow's cottage. Not all of them, but many. Bread held particular significance in medieval Christian culture that went far beyond its practical importance as staple food. In the Mass, bread became the body of Christ through the mystery of transubstantiation, ordinary wheat transformed into sacred substance. In the Lord's Prayer, bread represented all necessary provision. Give us this day our daily bread. In countless biblical stories, bread appeared as the vehicle of divine care. Manna in the wilderness, Elijah fed by ravens, the loaves and fishes, the bread of life discourse in John's Gospel. To tell a story about miraculous bread was to invoke this entire tradition, to connect one small event to a vast theological and spiritual inheritance. The widow herself embodied a figure that appeared repeatedly in Scripture and Christian tradition. The faithful poor woman whose trust in God is rewarded in unexpected ways. Widows in the ancient world were among the most vulnerable members of society, lacking the protection and provision that husbands provided, dependent on their own work and the charity of others. Yet widows appear again and again in biblical narratives as examples of faith and recipients of divine favor. Ruth, Naomi, the widow of Zarephath, the widow who gave her last 2 coins, the persistent widow in Jesus' parable who refused to give up seeking justice. The Christmas bread story placed the medieval widow in this tradition, making her part of a pattern that stretched across centuries, that connected Old Testament to New Testament to medieval Europe in one continuous thread of God's particular care for the vulnerable. This was not condescension. Medieval theology did not suggest that God favored the poor because they were somehow better or more deserving than the rich. Rather, it recognized that the poor had particular need, particular vulnerability, particular dependence on divine provision because human provision had failed them. The timing of the miracle, Christmas Eve, was significant in multiple ways. Christmas was the celebration of incarnation, of God entering human flesh, choosing vulnerability and poverty as the mode of divine presence in the world. Christ was born not in a palace, but in a stable, not to wealthy parents, but to a young couple far from home, not with royal attendants, but with farm animals as witnesses. The first visitors were shepherds, the lowest class of workers, people who smelled of sheep and lived on the margins of respectable society. Later came wealthy wise men, but first came the poor, the simple, the overlooked. The Christmas bread miracle echoed and reflected this pattern. God's provision came not to the wealthy or powerful, but to a poor widow. The miracle did not attract attention through spectacle, but operated quietly, almost secretly, known only to those who received bread and witnessed the impossible persistence of supply. It was, like the incarnation itself, a story of divine power choosing to manifest in humble circumstances, of the holy appearing in the ordinary, of heaven touching earth in ways that could easily be missed if you were not paying attention. Medieval people also understood the miracle in terms of what it taught about generosity. The widow's choice to give her last flour rather than keeping it for her children was the catalyst for everything that followed. The miracle did not happen before she gave. It happened as she gave, through her giving, because of her giving. This was a crucial distinction. She did not receive supernatural abundance and then decide to be generous. She chose generosity first, despite having nothing to spare, and abundance followed from that choice. This pattern spoke to a deep truth about how generosity works, how giving creates receiving, how opening your hand empties it, but also positions it to be filled again. The widow who clenches her fist around her last measure of flour keeps that flour, but receives nothing more. The widow who opens her hand and pours the flour out creates space for more flour to appear. Medieval theology understood this not as magic or as a mechanical transaction. Give and you will automatically receive, but as a spiritual principle, a description of how reality actually operates at its deepest level, beneath the surface appearances of scarcity and competition. The story also taught about trust in the face of uncertainty. The widow did not know how things would work out when she decided to bake bread for others rather than her children. She did not have a guarantee, did not receive advance knowledge that the bread would multiply or the barrel would refill. She stepped forward in faith, without knowing where her foot would land, and found that ground appeared beneath it. This was faith in its purest form, not certainty, not confidence based on evidence, but trust that acts before the outcome is known, that risks without assurance, that gives without calculating return. For medieval villages facing the constant threat of hunger, these lessons were not abstract theology, but practical wisdom for survival. They lived in a world of genuine scarcity, where food shortages were real and recurring, where the choice to share could mean the difference between a community surviving together or individuals dying alone. The Christmas bread story reinforced values that were essential for communal survival: generosity, sharing, trust, faith that giving would not result in abandonment, belief that helping others was compatible with, even necessary for, helping yourself. The story also provided comfort during the long, dark winters that tested both body and spirit. It reminded people that they were not alone in their struggles, that divine attention extended to the smallest and most mundane aspects of life, that God cared whether a widow could feed her children, whether a hungry villager received a piece of bread, whether a community made it through winter intact. This was not a distant God concerned only with cosmic matters and the fate of kingdoms. This was an intimate God who multiplied bread in a cottage kitchen, who filled a widow's barrel, who turned scarcity into sufficiency through small miracles that changed individual lives. The miracle's temporary nature, it lasted as long as it was needed, then faded, also carried meaning. The barrel did not remain endlessly full forever. According to the traditional telling, the miraculous provision continued through the worst of winter, then gradually ceased as spring approached and new sources of food became available. This suggested that miracles served specific purposes, met particular needs, operated according to divine timing rather than human convenience. They were not permanent solutions to structural problems, but interventions at crucial moments, bridges across particular difficulties, signs that pointed to larger truths while addressing immediate crises. As we come to the end of this tale, as we prepare to return from that medieval village to our own time and circumstances, it is worth reflecting on what this old story offers to us, so far removed from the world that gave it birth, so different in our material circumstances, yet perhaps not so different in our spiritual needs. We do not face the literal starvation that medieval villagers faced, most of us. Our winters, while cold, do not threaten survival in the same immediate way. Our food comes from stores and markets, not from barrels we filled ourselves in autumn and rationed carefully through months of scarcity. We are, in material terms, wealthier than any medieval peasant could have imagined, our lives cushioned by abundance that would have seemed miraculous to them, that would have exceeded their wildest dreams of plenty. Yet we know our own forms of scarcity. We face our own empty barrels, our own fears about whether there will be enough, our own calculations about whether we can afford to give when we feel we barely have enough for ourselves. The specifics are different, but the fundamental human situation remains. We must choose, again and again, between keeping and giving, between hoarding and sharing, between the prudent selfishness that seems necessary for survival and the imprudent generosity that seems like foolishness until it proves to be wisdom. The Christmas bread story speaks to these choices. It reminds us that sometimes, often actually, The way forward appears only when we step forward in faith, only when we open our hands and release our grip on whatever we have been clutching. It suggests that abundance is less about how much we have and more about what we do with what we have, how we hold it, whether we see it as ours alone or as ours to share. It teaches that the barrel that is hoarded empties inevitably, while the barrel that is but the story remains. It was told and retold, passed down through generations, surviving the loss of the physical cottage and the physical barrel and the physical people because it carried something that transcends physical existence. It survived because it spoke to permanent human needs, because it addressed questions that every generation must answer, because it pointed to truths that remain true regardless of how much the surface world changes. The story reminds us that we are part of something larger than ourselves, part of a human story that stretches back through time and forward into futures we will not see. The choices we make about generosity or selfishness, about faith or fear, about opening or clenching our hands. These choices echo the choices made by countless people before us and will be echoed by countless people after us. We are not the first to face these questions, and we will not be the last. And knowing this should give us both humility and courage. Humility because our struggles are not unique. Courage because others have faced them before and found ways forward, found grace sufficient for their needs, found that the barrel did not empty, found that love multiplied when shared. As snow falls gently in that long-ago village, as candles flicker in cottage windows, as a widow and her children sleep peacefully after a Christmas Eve that brought miracle instead of starvation, we can feel the warmth of that moment across the centuries. We can recognize ourselves in their hunger and their fear and their faith. We can learn from their choice to give rather than hoard, to trust rather than clutch, to believe that there is more to reality than what we can see and measure and control. The bread is long since eaten, the flour long since scattered, the barrel long since dust. But the lesson remains, carved not in stone or written in books, but inscribed on human hearts by the telling and retelling of this tale. Give when you have nothing to give. Share when sharing seems impossible. Trust that love creates its own abundance. Believe that the barrel will not empty, that the bread will multiply, that grace is real and provision comes, and generosity is not foolishness but the deepest wisdom. May this old story warm you through your own winters, whatever form they take. May it encourage you when you face your own empty barrels and impossible choices. May it remind you that miracles are not just ancient history but present possibility, that the same God who filled the widow's barrel still operates in our world, still multiplies bread, still honors faith, still responds to generosity with grace. And may you find, as that widow found, that giving empties your hands only to position them to receive, that sharing your last measure creates space for abundance, that faith is vindicated, that trust is honored, that love multiplies like loaves and like fishes, like bread that never runs out, like grace that endures through all our winters until spring comes again.